Is the fundamental nature of consciousness good, or is it neutral?
The default state of existence is bliss. I think this is the tide of our time that will carry us into a much more beautiful future.
Welcome to Commune. We are on a mission to inspire, heal, pass down wisdom, and bring the world closer together. This is the Commune podcast, where each week we explore the ideas and practices that help us live this healthy, connected, and purpose-filled life. So as we were eating nuts in preparation for this conversation, I was telling you about a bit of an emotional process that I'm going through right now, where we have a house that's been in the family for 100 years that is a lovely, beautiful house, not that far from where you live, and that my daughter was actually born in that front room. And on a stormy day in August, and the skies cleared, and a rainbow appeared, and the bluefish started jumping, and all this kind of beautiful, bucolic kind of scene. And we've had so many memories there, and but it's a completely irrational thing to own and to have and to maintain. And so, to satisfy sort of our rational brain, we've been sort of pathetically trying to sell it for a long time in an effort really not to sell it. And then sort of lo and behold, someone came along and did purchase it, and we're just going to contract now. And dealing with this idea of letting go of something in the material world that does legitimately hold, I guess, what you might think of as you might define as something sacred. And I guess my question would be is like, when do things in the material world hold like a symbolic value that is real and important and not just kind of fleeting and ephemeral?
It's not just a symbolic value. You could ask the same question about your old dog. This dog is, well, I have a sentimental attachment to it. It's been in the family for a long time, but it can no longer do the work that the dog used to do to corral the chickens or whatever it did. So rationally, there's no reason to keep maintaining this dog. Why don't we just put it down? We don't think that, like, we wouldn't do that for a beloved dog or your, grandmother or something like that. But for a house, that's okay, right? Because this house is not a being. It's just a material thing. This devaluation of materiality, I think, is a problem. It's not to say that you should treat a house the same way you should treat a dog or a human being, but it's to ask, what is the right way to treat the house? You can't, by analogy, give it the same treatment you would give your grandmother, but to even consider that there is a right way to do it that takes into account the house as being, and not just as symbol, what it means to you, but to actually be in a relationship to it. And what I was proposing to you before is that you understand this potentially as a breakup, like a breakup with someone that you really love. And how do you go about that breakup, and why would you break up with somebody? Maybe you are ready to go your separate ways. But I think that whether or not, and maybe you're not ready to break up. Maybe you realize, but either way, if you do understand it as a breakup, then you'll be able to go through whatever ritual or process you need to so that you feel okay with it.
Right. And I suppose that my individual plight, my petty little life, is just, a speck on the top of a pinhead. But that this notion of letting go, of moving on, I think anyone can see their story in that. And is there ways to essentially instill these things with meaning. And I like, for example, you talk about something, inanimate objects or material objects, that we can sort of almost toss them away as if they don't really matter.
Mm-hmm.
But actually they have a life to them, right? So how do we, what is that process of grace in a breakup?
I think it's a pretty bad habit to treat the material things of the world as if they don't matter.
Yeah.
Because collectively, as humanity, we are now treating the planet as if it were some material thing that doesn't matter.
Right.
And this ideal of the separate self kind of floating above materiality, and yeah, I moved from this house to that house, and I'm not attached. I'm not attached to this thing. I'm not attached to anything material. This is a conceit. This kind of independence is a conceit, because you could apply it to human beings too. And there are, I think, distorted spiritual teachings that counsel us to avoid attachment. Right. But I think that to avoid attachment is to avoid being fully alive. And that real life isn't about protecting yourself from the pain of loss, but it's really going in there and fully loving, and knowing that you're going to lose everything that you love, and being willing to go through the grief of that.
Ooh, yes.
Then you've lived.
Yes. I read that Eric Fromm wrote something about this, which is like, there is a way not to grieve, but the only option not to grieve is also not to love.
Yeah.
And who would want that life? And then, but then that brings up something for me that I really have been grappling with, and I talked about it with your wonderful team around the table too late into the evening last night, which is this notion of non-attachment, and that on some level that, and this is, speaks directly to Buddhism, I suppose, that, we are all constantly distracted by desire, and desire, this sort of incessant desire, is at the core of suffering. I'm like fidgeting around in my chair just to always kind of elicit some sort of pleasant feeling, all the way up to like, I need my McMansion in the hills. And that essentially you can cultivate practice to sort of separate yourself from this desire and find what I guess one might call consciousness, something outside of your thoughts, feelings, objects that you perceive through your limited five senses. And that then in this kind of seat of the soul, in this true self, there is this awareness. And one of the things that I have been trying to grapple with is this. Is the fundamental nature of consciousness good, or is it neutral? Essentially, if you can cultivate that true awareness outside of feelings, emotions, objects, is that characterized by love, compassion, empathy, or is it something that is just purely neutral and focusable on good, fear, evil, da-da-da?
The default state of existence is bliss. Everything else is a temporary excursion away from that. Which doesn't mean that these excursions are a mistake. Ultimately, they feed an evolutionary process where life and the universe become more and more alive, and being becomes more and more existent, more and more complex, more and more related, more and more full. So the question then becomes, okay, yeah, desire births suffering, but maybe this whole journey into suffering, this whole excursion, is happening for a reason. It's what I was just saying about plunging into life. And okay, another way to look at it is, okay, so yeah, say desire causes suffering, but what are you going to do with that information? Can you exercise your will to suppress desire?
Yeah.
Or could it be that desire needs to be fulfilled and exposed for its false premises before you can even transcend it? And that doesn't mean you're transcending all desire. Maybe it means you're just transcending this desire. I think that the problem isn't desire. The problem is that the primal energy of desire gets diverted onto false objects that don't actually meet the desire, like the McMansion in the hills.
Right.
You know, what's the real desire there? It's probably not for the McMansion in the hills, because if it were, you would live happily ever after if you had that.
Yes.
But the same hunger that is grasping for the mansion in the hills isn't satisfied by the mansion in the hills.
Right. Yeah.
So maybe what it really wants is the feeling of being at home in the world.
Right.
But don't know how to get that, don't even know what that is, so I'll go for the mansion. But maybe even to realize that that is what I wanted all along requires that you first get the mansion.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's funny, I saw like a heat map of one of these McMansions of where people actually spend their time in the McMansion.
The breakfast nook.
It was clustered in the breakfast nook in the bed. And then there's, 10,000 square feet of space that never get used. And because they never get used, because it feels so foreign. And that, yes, I think, what you're saying, and I think what we might agree upon is that we are essentially always pursuing happiness through the accumulation of goods and services that will never really serve us. And I want to go back, because something that I feel that is so fundamental to your philosophical approach on the human condition is separation and the separate self. So I wonder if you could just, I don't want to make you regurgitate that for the 50,000th time, but I think because it is so fundamental, I'd love for you to talk about kind of what that means and sort of how we got there, and then play that forward into modern society. What are the implications of it? How do we address it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the separate self is the myth that underlies our entire civilization. All of our systems and institutions tap into the myth of separation. And I mean myth, not in the sense of some, fantasy, some ridiculous thing.
Aeschylus.
But a myth in terms of a story that explains the world. Mm. So the story of separation explains who you are. You're a separate individual. You are a soul encased in flesh. You are a Cartesian mote of consciousness, et cetera, et cetera. It answers the question, why are you here? It's to survive, to reproduce, to maximize your self-interest. There's really almost no why you're here in this story. It says it answers the question, what is the way to live? And what are human beings for? And what constitutes progress? And it is that humans are separate from nature, destined to rise above nature, to dominate nature, to transcend nature, to harness natural forces, to someday no longer need nature. It also says what the nature of reality is and how change happens in the world. What are the ruling powers of this world?
Right.
It's forces in the story of separation. And I could go on. And often what I do in my work is I say, okay, how exactly does that basic paradigm inform our medical system or our economic system,
right,
or our spirituality or our politics? And you can see the traces of separation in all of these institutions.
Yes. I suppose one could trace the sort of evolution of the notion of the separate self to various inflection points in history, from, forager to agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago, and surplus and primogenitorism, and this is mine and not yours.
Right. Division of labor, social classes, money, writing, technology, et cetera, yeah.
Right. And do you feel that essentially, and this is something I've been also grappling with a bit, which is that the Enlightenment, which essentially has been the most influential philosophical movement into that sort of governs modern life, that essentially has sanctified the virtues of the individual, that the individual should decide who governs, that the customer is always right, that beauty is always in the eye of the beholder, like all of these things that consistently sanctify the individual's point of view, that the individualism, freedom, that increasingly gets defined as my ability to own property and to like accrue, that is alloyed in some way with sort of science, reason, a sort of rational-based systems or thoughts that create systems and structures around that define you and me as separate, around scarcity, which you talk a lot about, through sort of a mutually beneficial transactional relationship between each other, and that it is that system, which I suppose is embodied in modern capitalism, consumerist culture, that leads us continually on this pathway of separateness, of individual materialism. And would you say that in order to undo that, to ungird that, do we need a new movement of reinstilling universal truths and principles into our life? Essentially, I'm not championing the Middle Ages or faith-based approaches to veracity, but it feels like we live in a completely relativist society where there are no values. And so we just are on this treadmill. And I wonder, what do we need?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the scope of that question is very broad. I'm just going to pick on maybe one little piece of it.
Yeah.
That was brought to mind before when you talked about our projection of meaning onto the world. I can't remember exactly how you put it, but this is part of one of it's one of the currents of the story of separation that says that meaning is created by human beings and projected onto the world because the world itself does not have meaning or intelligence or design or anything like that. It's just the result of random processes that don't have consciousness or purpose.
Right.
In themselves.
Teleology, yeah.
Right. So this is a kind of anthropocentrism.
Right.
That
yeah.
It's oddly enough, we think that anthropocentrism began to turn with Copernicus, where humans were no longer at the center of the cosmos. But scientific ideology still centers us in an even more profound way as the sole possessors of consciousness or intelligence.
Right.
It speaks to this helplessness that I hear so often of what are we going to do about this?
Yeah, right.
As if it were up to us. So you inquired, how do we launch a movement or to reverse the tide of separation? Because it seems like it's going to take some mighty effort to accomplish this turnaround. But you know what? The current story did not result from a mighty, intentional, purposeful effort. Right. So it's not like we got down and said, okay, things aren't going very well. Let's launch the story of separation. The alternative understanding is that we are carried by a process and a movement that is much, much bigger than anything that we can create or intend. That is to step back from this anthropocentrism. It's not, our future is not fundamentally what we are consciously creating. And this goes against a lot of spiritual teachings where you become the conscious creator of your reality.
Right.
Where do we get that arrogance? I think it is an extension of the technological mindset, which is that we're going to put the human stamp onto the disordered, chaotic, wild world outside of ourselves. Mm-hmm. So we want to do the same individually through these spiritual practices and collectively by creating a vision of the future and stamping that onto the future. I think that's just as necessary as it is for a fetus, a baby is being born, to make sure that that birth happens. It's not that the fetus has no role. It's easier to give birth to a live baby than to a stillborn because the livingness of the baby responds to the contractions, the birth process of the mother. And that response is itself part of the process. So right now, like a baby being born, we are subject to what we experience as titanic forces. And we don't know what's happening to us and we don't know what to do, but we respond to those in whatever way that we know how. We understand those in the way that we understand them, responding accordingly. We have no idea really what's going on here. Part of our response is to make meanings and to try to impose them onto what's happening, to try to control what's happening. It's not bad to do that. That itself is part of the response. And to say we're not going to try to control it is itself a form of control. And this search for, okay, what are we supposed to do now? It taps into the lineage of our role is to be the doers.
The doer, yeah.
Yeah. And that is necessary when, sorry to run on here, but
no, this is good.
That's necessary when there is no larger doing that we can participate in. And what I'm offering is, at the current stage right now, not to stop doing and stop responding, but we are being carried by an inconceivable, mysterious process.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting because in some ways it defies the instinct that I have of like, we need a spiritual awakening. That I just read, it was Martin Luther King Day on Monday. I took a little bit of time to actually read, imagine that, the letter from a Birmingham jail where he essentially is addressing a bunch of clergy in Birmingham that are essentially speaking out against marching, against passive resistance and nonviolence and everything that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was doing with Martin Luther King. And so he writes this response from the Birmingham jail, which is essentially like, we are all connected. That essentially if my daughter can read, but your daughters can't, then I am poor. Essentially interconnected, interdependent, spiritual messages, come to the fore that have over time addressed the salient societal problems or issues where, like if you look at slavery, the abolition movement had its roots in Quakerism. I mean, oftentimes when we hit these loggerheads, that the answers tend to lie in our spiritual underpinnings. And, and I want to talk about politics because I don't think the change is going to come from there. But I think what's interesting about what you're saying is that Oh, you're like, Jeff, no, 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 don't wait. Jesus is not going to roll in and say like, oh, everybody, we've been misguided. Here again are your universal truths. Everyone get back in line. Capitalism's built some nice plumbing for society to function, but we're pumping shit through it. You got to like work through a lens of these values and you'll be cool. But what I'm hearing is that that's not going to come from us necessarily.
It is being born within us and from us. It's not something that we can engineer. Our engineering efforts are part of it, but it is itself beyond our engineering. It's beyond our contrivance. It's beyond our understanding. We can understand it maybe in retrospect, maybe in hundreds of years now, we can name, here is what the transition was. But from where we are now, we cannot map it out. We cannot plan it. And therefore, current politics in terms of, okay, let's form some policies that are going to bring us through this transition, all of those will fall woefully short of the task. However, we can also sense that there is a destination. Otherwise, we would have no hope. The hope doesn't come from any rational projection that we can make it through the current emergency, because what we need to make it through doesn't even exist in the vocabulary of reason as society accepts it. I'm not saying it's irrational, but according to the premises that the old story of separation establishes, it is impossible. According to what that's part of the myth. The myth tells us what's possible and what isn't. According to what it says is possible, there's no way. There's no way anything's ever going to change. Is it possible for there to be true peace in the Mideast, say between Israelis and Palestinians? I'm not talking like a ceasefire. I'm talking about brotherhood.
Right.
I'm talking about
fraternity,
forgiveness.
Yes.
Yeah, redemption,
Right.
healing. Is that? It's not even like the most modest peace proposals seem to be politically naive. So it's impossible, according to what we have established in our common perception as possible.
Right.
So that means that anything that we can constitute politically won't reach anywhere close to the destination that we paradoxically know exists. Therefore, to get to that destination, we have to accept a different guidance, a guidance that lies outside the realm of what we have agreed is possible. We have some help in this journey because most people that I meet anyway have in fact experienced the impossible. They've experienced things that the old story embodied in science tells them is possible. So, it tells them is impossible. So,
Right.
And these anomalous experiences, it's as if they are coming from the future. And each one that we experience creates a thread linking present with that particular future. These are the signposts, the breadcrumbs that we can follow to reach a place that we don't know how to reach.
But when is this coming, Charles? And is it going to be too late? That's very anthropocentric in and of itself, just the question. And I suppose, I think, from what I'm hearing is that not to discount the millions of people's lives that would be affected between, let's say, a Donald Trump presidency and an Elizabeth Warren presidency, that there are minimum wage and healthcare and, essentially millions of people's lives that would be affected that I don't want to discount. But you might say that we're talking about very narrow goalposts that separate these two figures, even though their countenance couldn't be more different at some level. And that the the new story will emerge outside those narrow parameters, sort of, you know, from MSNBC on one side and Fox on the other
Right.
side. It would be like, you know, tight little parentheses.
Right. Yeah. Outside that, I mean, politics, that spectrum from right to left is a one-dimensional spectrum.
Right. Yeah.
So the future that we want isn't only outside those two poles, but on the same axis. It's totally in a different dimension.
Yes.
The things that need to happen are not even considered political issues.
Right. They're essentially spiritual issues, potentially.
Or they could be, you could see them as being part of a different kind of politics. But we talked about this in the course, you know, what's left out of the conversation when we define the issues as being a certain set of positions.
Right.
Like, you know, Obamacare, should it be repealed or not? Well, what gets left out is the entire universe of holistic and alternative treatments. I mean, we don't question the healthcare system itself. It's just kind of like who pays for it. Mm-hmm. Or if we're talking about education, more or less public funding, does that even consider the question of school as an institution of the industrial age to train people to be compliant, obedient factory workers? Or if we're talking about, I mean, we can go down the line. Like I think the most important issues today are not really discussed because the spectacle, the froth, and controversy mesmerizes us.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Marianne Williamson says we keep watering the leaves and not the roots. It's not that we're not interested in exhuming the roots, but I don't think, and this is certainly not what mass media is interested in. So it needs to be sort of a self-propelled journey to look deeper. And, you know, when I think of like global warming, and I think of like the oil and gas executive that wakes up in the morning, even that person, I don't think wakes up in the morning with the intention of, I'm going to warm the globe today.
Right.
Let's see, 1,415 parts per million. By the end of the day, 420. You know, like nobody is doing that. No one. But in the absence of a new story, of essentially what I think of are values, he goes to work, and then that's the natural output. In the absence of values, medical innovation gets used for the pharmaceutical industry that just essentially keeps people on drugs instead of off of drugs. Agricultural innovation goes to sponsored by Monsanto instead of actually feeding the people of the world. And I wonder if you think that that is essentially what this new story is potentially about. Is it about the reinstilling of a value-based society or value-based culture that then will change consciousness, and then all of those things will change? Leaders, laws, policies, platforms?
Not so much.
No.
I think that, I mean, most people hold beautiful universal values. It's that the story hijacks the values and diverts our creative energies toward things that pretend to serve those values, but actually do not. Yeah, and it's true that values also do evolve and deepen over time. But it's, as you were saying, it's not that the oil company executive does not value peace, love, fulfillment, beauty, truth. If you could extract him from the reinforcing circumstances of his life, then you could probably have just as, I mean, you could take Donald Trump, and if you got him in the right situation, you can have a beautiful conversation with him. So the question is, what are the circumstances that pervert those values or redirect those values, hijack those values?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think it goes back to separation that then always induces some sort of self-interested behavior. So do you know this guy, Stephen West? He hosts a podcast called Philosophize This. Really great. And he was talking about this, I guess you'd call him a political theorist, John Rawls.
Yeah,
who,
right. Theory of justice. Yeah.
Right, and distributive justice and things like that. And he brings up this example, I think it was quite interesting, which is like, let's say you've got a whole group of people over at your house, or you're even Donald Trump, and you get delivered a pizza from a pizza guy. And you like open the box and you're like, oh, but wait, this pizza looks great, but it's not cut up. It's just one big pie that hasn't been cut up. And your job is to cut the pizza up. But with the caveat is you don't know what piece you're going to end up with. Mm-hmm. So how do you cut it up?
Right.
And I mean, you can answer the question for yourself, but I think even Donald Trump might make this calculation of like, well, it's a socialist cut up. It's like, I'm going to cut it up evenly because I don't know what piece I'm going to end up with, right?
Right.
But that's not how distributive justice functions. That essentially you end up with a big piece, or you start with a big piece, or you start with a small piece. And then, it's up to us to figure out how to create a sense of justice around that. And I bring that up because I think that the most visible badge of separation right now in modern culture is like income inequality, and polarization, atomization.
Yeah. Okay. So you brought up dehumanization. I didn't really address that. And then you're bringing up John Rawls. These are actually connected because as you're illustrating with the pizza metaphor, what John Rawls said is that the just society is one where you set it up and you don't know which role you're going to be. Your role is assigned randomly.
Right.
So what society would you choose knowing that you don't know who you're going to be? That, and it's a very beautiful idea.
Yes.
And it taps into the understanding that we are all on some level of equal worth, that everybody should have a fair lot.
Right.
And that somebody who's in some miserable sweatshop doesn't deserve that any more than you would deserve it. Like you're not better or worse than any other person. Dehumanization is a necessary, I would even call it a prerequisite for an unjust society. You have to have some way to explain to yourself why someone deserves to be a slave, or why it's okay that this person is working behind the counter at Sbarro, and I'm, getting on a first-class flight to Tahiti. Like, right. Otherwise, the incongruity of that is disturbing. Yeah. So dehumanization is necessary for an unjust society to operate. And the habits, one of the big problems, so if we accept that dehumanization is at the root of a lot of our social problems, and it's certainly at the root of warfare, it's again universal. You have to dehumanize the enemy, demonize the enemy even, associate them with evil in order to justify bombing them and killing them.
Right.
And this pattern of thought, this habit of perception called dehumanization, is so pervasive that people employ it even in service to healing the effects of dehumanization. Yeah. Like So they employ dehumanization as a way to arouse hatred and indignation at those oil companies. If I were one of those executives, I wouldn't be doing that. I wouldn't wake up in the morning feeling good about my work. I wouldn't sacrifice the future of the whole planet for my own greed. Like you muster a story like that, and then you get people really so riled up at this diabolical enemy that they will do anything it takes to tear them down, and the problem is solved. So it taps into the belief that the solution to a problem is to kill something. That is also characteristic of modern medicine and modern agriculture, and even to some extent modern spirituality. So you can see like how all-encompassing this way of thinking is, and therefore how deep the revolution is that we want to undergo.
Right. Yes. And so playing that forward a bit, if you're, I suppose, fashion yourself a conscious human being or an aware human being, how would then you go about addressing injustices that you see in the world that then are perpetuated by certain roles or figureheads or models, whether that be Mr. Exxon, Mr. Trump, whatever, essentially without dehumanizing? What is the approach?
Well, if you want to, so I'll preface this by saying that sometimes it might be necessary to fight Mr. Exxon or Mr. Trump.
Yes.
But even if that's the case, your fight is going to be more effective if you actually understand this person and why they're doing what they're doing, rather than abdicating any attempt to explain it by saying, well, they're just bad.
Right.
When you say they're just bad, you're resisting any attempt to explain, to understand. There's no understanding there. It's a substitute for understanding. So even if you are going to fight them, demonizing them in your own mind is a liability.
Right.
And it also forecloses any possibility of any other response besides fighting. But if you understand, what is it that makes a Donald Trump? What are the totality of circumstances that causes the fracking executive to do what he's doing?
Right.
Then you have other options besides defeating that person. You can also maybe find some way to change the conditions. If you don't do that, if you don't understand the conditions that create a Donald Trump, and I'm not wanting to name him as the bogeyman here.
Yeah, sure.
I've never met the guy. He might, I mean, who knows?
By many accounts, he's lovely in person.
Yeah. But if you don't examine those circumstances, even if you do take him down, guess what? The circumstances are still there. You're going to get a new Donald Trump.
Right.
Or somebody, some new occupant of a role that is systemically necessary.
Yes. I often hear this kind of nostalgia for Barack Obama, and then which also brings me to the point of like, actually, well, nostalgia actually means our pain, but that the good old days of like a leader that was graceful, compassionate, without controversy, but then of course the conditions for our current situation were essentially that soil was cultivated over that period of time. So it's not fair to be kind of looking at figureheads per se and saying and attributing human condition to various figureheads when you're not addressing the underlying root cause.
But it's comforting.
Yeah, it is comforting. Yes.
There's a perverse comfort in ascribing the evils of the world to some evil people, even if they are these, ultra powerful Illuminati that you could never take down. There's still a comfort there because in principle, at least you know what to do. You know how to solve the problem. It's to take those fuckers down.
Yes.
But that vent, that outlet for the energy of not knowing what to do does us a huge disservice, because if we could stew in the helplessness and not divert onto a ready false solution, maybe we'd be able to actually find some real solutions.
Right. And we talked about this a bit yesterday, but I think there's a concrete example of the efficacy of rehumanization in restorative justice. And maybe there is a restorative politics that that can mirror some of the qualities of restorative justice, that addresses the harm done to the victim, is not just focused on punishment for the assailant, actually humanizes the assailant and tries to understand the conditions from which they came that led them to that behavior, that actually tries to create a direct communication between victim and assailant that is humanizing. I wonder how that could be done in politics, because there was a time when it wasn't as vitriolic, right? You know, it's sort of like there's kind of a nostalgia to that too, where it was like a bunch of like cigar smoking plutocrats on the left, on the right, like having a drink in a back room, kind of just chumming, working its stuff out. Or the Rockefeller Republicans that were somewhat moderate. But now, you know, there's so much vitriol, right? It's like so much atomization, fracturization, or fractured nature to debate. Is there sort of a model for, I suppose, restorative politics?
I think that the warfare that we see among our political figures, it's an outgrowth of a more generalized polarization of society, or even a barometer of that.
Yeah.
So, yes, I think that there is a path toward a restorative politics. It involves rehumanization, just as restorative justice puts victim and perpetrator together and offers the opportunity for apology and forgiveness, offers an opportunity for each to really hear the other's story. That's what's rehumanizing. To hear your story, if I hear the story of why you locked me in the closet and starved me for 4 days when I thought I was coming here to record a course, like,
I'm sorry. Well, that's how we got you up here. And then, of course, there's the reality of the torture chamber. But yeah.
Right. But if I understand, like, your whole background, and I'm like, oh, I understand now why you did that, then there's a possibility of real forgiveness.
Yeah.
Real forgiveness is difficult. Real forgiveness is not an act of indulgence. That's fake forgiveness. Real forgiveness only comes through a meeting of the souls. And one way to do that is to tell your story and to have that story really be heard. So I think politically, we can do the same to create conditions, and starting at the grassroots even, not necessarily just the leaders, but starting at the grassroots where people can hear each other's stories. Then they can't dehumanize each other anymore.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I think what it is in some ways, we were talking about Hannah Arendt a bit, which is essentially, she would claim that essentially the conditions that lead to like authoritarianism, totalitarianism, are like a real sense for belonging that is missing, that there is no identity, so then you can roll in with a red cap and, fancy slogan and get people all riled up, kind of ratchet up the fear, serve up an enemy, and off you go. But that really what we're lacking is sort of what you're saying, which are forums for the exchange of ideas amongst free individuals, or the exchange of stories that can essentially create a level of humanization. I mean, I guess the dominant narrative in American culture is like, oh, we've got a bunch of liberal cappuccino sipping folks on the coasts, and then we've got like a bunch of folks in kind of agrarian and manufacturing Rust Belt Midwest flyover states or whatever, and that have been quote unquote left behind, and that these are the folks that then, like essentially out of desperation, fear, whatever, voted for Trump. Like this is the narrative, and that are there ways to essentially create forums where people can hear each other again, because it's hard to hate up close.
It's hard to hate up close. Yeah, and one of these Trump voting, quote, deplorables,
Right.
if you really hear their life story, you can't deplore them.
No.
You can't hate them.
Yeah.
And the same thing, like if one of them could hear the story of an illegal immigrant who,
it's the same story.
Yeah,
yes.
like these are heartbreaking stories.
Yeah.
What it takes for somebody to leave their family and come with their children with no guarantee that they're ever going to make it. I mean, and the horrors that happen to them. You cannot hear those stories and uphold the standard right-wing, narrative about the immigrants.
Yeah.
You don't have to even see the paradigm of punishment that you were referencing before just keeps coming back and back and back. It's like it can become like, well, let's make them feel bad by telling the story as an act of violence. There has to be an attitude of generosity and of peace in the sharing of stories. Because, I could say more about punishment. I mean, there's...
Do you think, I'd like to talk about that. I'm also I want to continue to mine this story component and how we actually create structures for this exchange of story and idea. I mean, is it that what we need to return to is more local, decentralized forms of community? I read this quote the other day. I think John Maynard Keynes quote: "It's easier to ship recipes than cakes and biscuits," which is sort of like on the surface, kind of like neither here nor there. But then when you essentially think of like, well, this pen the ink was probably made somewhere, and then this was made in China, and then it was shipped over here, and now we're sitting here in Topanga. That like essentially that we've developed great piping to share information and technology or recipes, essentially, and is the part of the solution being able to create structures and systems that reward sort of distributed leadership, decentralized organization, where people are actually can have that exchange of story. And what does that look like?
Yeah, the answer to the question is yes.
Yeah.
As far as what does it look like?
I mean, I look at models like AA.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
The decentralization of production, and the distribution of production for most things makes a lot of sense and would certainly bring more connection and community and meaning into people's lives. There are some things that do not suit themselves toward local production.
Yeah.
Microchips and things like that,
right?
Perhaps. But most things that are produced globally should be much more local. Food, shelter, entertainment. But I think there's another level too, that even the recipes should be more local.
Right, yeah.
Because they reference local conditions and, properly speaking, should come from local culture, which is not just a decoration on a place, but is actually rooted in and part of a place, even an outgrowth of a place. The culture is part of the land. The land is part of the culture. Yeah. So when you're talking about recipes, you're talking about a cultural product that I think also should be decentralized. But at the same time, there is this whole ascent of humanity to a mass global society has also happened for a reason. So it's not to, I don't advocate completely dismantling the collective global intelligence, but to revalidate the other levels of organization and intelligence.
Right. Yeah. It's an interesting, I suppose, dichotomy where sort of like I think this bucolic vision of liberal democracy has been kind of this globalism, slightly kumbaya vision of the world. And that is essentially, has led to a lot of these modern issues and problems. At the same time, at the root of it, I think is like there's a benevolence at the root of it, which is that, that is kind of Judeo-Christian in a way of like, hey, we're all equal and God made all of our souls equally and will judge us all equally. But that globalism flies kind of directly into the face of more kind of decentralized organization for society. I look at like the blue zones being like interesting examples, like these kind of little enclaves around the world, and I think there's 5 of them where people are like cognitively and physiologically thriving into their hundreds in like Icaria, Greece, and these places that seem like to have maintained their local cultures and traditions. You can be like, well, they walk a lot and they have a good diet. All that thing's true too, but I think what you're saying is that they have maintained a sense of their own identity that isn't global.
Right. Yeah. The point you were making about fascism, I think, is important. And it's also the same point can be made about consumerism, because a lot of excess consumption is an attempt to construct an identity using brands and things. So somebody who has lost the cultural stories that attach them to place and to community is a ripe target for consumerism and for fascism, because if you don't have rich multi-dimensional relationships with the people and place, you don't know who you are. And the fascist, or even Donald Trump, this is true of every party. They come in and say, here's who you are.
Yeah.
And if you are in that identity crisis, that's really compelling. Here's who you are. Here's a story that gives meaning to life.
Yes. Yeah.
And you're not going to examine it very deeply.
There you go. I'll put that shirt on.
Yeah, you put the shirt on.
Put the fucking hat on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because what else do you have?
Yeah.
You're disaffiliated.
Right.
You probably live somewhere else than where your family grew up. You don't work for the family business. You maybe don't even go to church. So
if there is still a family business, that's
right.
a strong piece of identity, a family business.
Yes.
But how many family businesses have succumbed to, Dunkin' Donuts and Walmart and Amazon?
Yes.
Where you become an interchangeable cog in the machine.
Yeah. I want to talk, to round it out, about a bit about regenerative agriculture, and its role in climate change. Some people don't like the word climate change. I don't know where you are in that. Paul Hawken is like, it's not about chance global warming. Stop using mitigating language. I don't really know. But because I met you through Ryland Engelhardt and the Kiss the Ground folks, and we actually did a course with them around soil and the carbon sequestration properties of soil. That honestly I thought it was like, this is a very philanthropic thing to do with them, and we'll put it on the platform, and it'll be like, look like we're fulfilling like our role as like a good social impact conscious company. Admittedly, it was a little bit of that. It was, and it was so popular. We had like 30 some odd thousand people sign up for that thing. I'm like, well, they're not going to be all farmers, obviously. But I wonder how you think about regenerative agriculture, how you understand it in the overall context of climate change and addressing it.
Yeah. Climate change is another issue that my opinion is off the spectrum of opinion, which is defined on the one end
That's your happy place.
by catastrophe, and on the
Yeah.
other end by skepticism, or denialism, as you might call it. I prefer skepticism. This is one of my operating principles, is that in any polarized debate, the key to the debate lies in what neither side is talking about, or in the assumptions that they both share unconsciously. And one of them is that in the environmental issue, the most important thing to be talking about is carbon. So kiss the ground. I am a big proponent, enthusiastic proponent of regenerative agriculture. But for me, it's not because of carbon sequestration. It's because I understand soil as one of the organs of a living being called Gaia, or called Earth. I understand that without healthy soil, Earth will survive no better than you would survive without skin. Yes, it sequesters carbon, or helps modulate the levels of carbon in the atmosphere, but in my mind, more importantly, it helps to regulate the water cycle. Healthy soil absorbs rainfall that would otherwise run off and be a flood, and then as it absorbs it, replenishes aquifers and waters plants, trees especially, grasses, that then transpire the water into what would otherwise be the dry season, creating clouds, recycling that moisture as rain, extending the dry season. So thereby first mitigating floods, and then preventing drought. Someone was telling me they were in, I think it was Jamaica or something, one of the Caribbean nations, where in the recent hurricane, none of the villages that had intact coastal wetlands suffered any loss of life. It was only the ones where there had been development and wetlands draining where there had been catastrophe, because these wetlands, absorb the incoming water. And the same thing happens for land-based wetlands. So basically what I'm seeing, and this is part of the basic mentality of warfare, which is that if you want to solve a situation, solve a problem, the first thing you do is you find the enemy, or you find the one thing to attack.
Yeah.
So carbon dioxide fits the bill.
Right.
It's one thing to attack. Better yet, it's quantifiable. So we can use all of the methods and mindsets of accounting to minimize a number.
Yes.
And I think that, as in any kind of reductionism, the important stuff gets left out. So I personally do not think that global warming per se is the biggest threat. I think that it could easily result from ecocide, from the destruction of the organs of Gaia that, just like your organs, help maintain homeostasis.
Right.
But we could equally see catastrophic cooling or catastrophic fluctuations. There's a lot more I wrote a whole book on this, so it's hard for me to summarize it now, but just as an example of the real issue being off the radar screen of conventional polarized positions.
Yes. It's almost like you are a functional medicine doctor applying the theories of functional medicine outside of medicine on some level, like to climate, to politics, that always not really, I mean, it's not that the orthodoxy and the conversation up here doesn't matter, but that there is a root cause that really is the thing that needs to be focused on. And, it's funny that I'm having sort of like minor epiphany right now about what you're saying, and like this regenerative agriculture course that we did, because my sense is that of those 30 some odd thousand people that signed up for that course, how many people are going to be a regenerative, like, agricultural farmer? 5, 3, 10, 20, 50? I don't know. But my sense is that it is that there is a thirst to feel a part of nature where people have felt so divorced from it. And I think that might have been the reason why people they're innately drawn to this notion of connection, and don't have always all the resources available to get to that.
Yeah. And I think maybe we could wrap up by saying that actually answers the question that you posed earlier. Like, what is the nature of this movement that will reverse the tide of separation?
Yeah.
And it is exactly this, it's reunion, it's reconnection, powered by what you're describing, this yearning to connect to nature again, to be part of the global reuniting of all that we have separated off.
Yeah.
All of the beings, all of the people, the races, the cultures, the living things of this earth, to come together again. I think this is the tide of our time that will carry us into a much more beautiful future.
Yeah. Thank you for coming to a strange place called Commune where there's no internet. Of course, there's internet here, but as you arrive here, you lose all signal. You have to confront any fear that there might be like 40 naked people having sex or something.
Well,
like
I did
that.
have a momentary panic attack when it said no service on my phone, but I worked through it.
Good for you. And it is a distinct pleasure to also meet someone that's forsaken all of health and beauty aid products like myself, and we can compare how long we've gone without washing our hair.
How long we say beautiful, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Charles.
Yeah, thanks.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you liked this interview from the Commune podcast, then I think you'll love this video right here. And if you want to get more weekly content from Commune, you can subscribe right here on our YouTube channel or find the Commune podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jeff Krasno, and I am here for you.